A telescope lens focuses on the jagged silhouette of Dorchester Heights looming over the harbor. Redcoat sentries freeze, their muskets dropping as they stare at the impossible earthworks crowning the summit. Below them, the British fleet sits helpless, trapped in the crosshairs of heavy cannons positioned overnight. General William Howe grips his spyglass, his knuckles white against the brass. He watches the Continental flag snap in the morning wind, a signal that his entire occupation has just collapsed. The rebels achieved in a single night what his professional army could not accomplish in months. The city of Boston was no longer a stronghold, but a cage. General William Howe stood on his balcony on the morning of March 5, 1776. He stared through the haze toward the high ground of Dorchester Heights. The landscape had changed completely since the previous sunset. Massive earthen mounds now ringed the hilltops. Heavy siege cannons peered over the newly constructed parapets. The muzzles of the artillery pointed directly down at the British fleet anchored in the harbor. Howe lowered his glass and turned to his staff officers. He acknowledged that the rebels had accomplished more in one night than his entire army in months. The British command realized their strategic position had vanished. The Continental Army had successfully occupied the high ground under the cover of darkness. They had turned the terrain into a fortress overnight. Every ship in the harbor was now within range of American fire. General John Thomas commanded the troops that held the heights. His men stood behind the walls of fascines and hay bales. They had spent the night hauling heavy timber frames into position. These frames, known as chandeliers, allowed for rapid fortification without the sound of digging. The British had been completely unaware of the massive transport operation occurring just miles away. The threat was not just the cannons, but the precision of the American logistics. The city of Boston was suddenly vulnerable to a devastating bombardment. Howe paced the floor of his headquarters, calculating the cost of a counterattack. His officers assessed the steep incline of the slopes leading up to the rebel positions. The Continental forces had reinforced the hill with barrel bombs. These were heavy casks filled with stones and explosives, ready to be rolled into any attacking infantry. A direct assault would result in catastrophic casualties for the King's men. The British commanders looked toward the harbor and saw their only path for survival. The occupation of Dorchester Heights had rendered the city of Boston militarily untenable. The rebels had seized the initiative through a masterful display of engineering. The strategic gravity of the war had shifted in less than 12 hours. Howe faced a decision that would define the remainder of the British campaign. He could attempt a costly amphibious landing or abandon the city entirely. The silence from the heights was more intimidating than any direct challenge. The Continental Army watched from above, waiting for the British to react. The morning of March 5th marked the beginning of the end for the British occupation. Snow crunches under the heavy iron wheels of a sled at Fort Ticonderoga. Colonel Henry Knox inspects the massive bronze barrels resting on the frozen ground. He selects 43 cannons, 14 mortars, and 2 howitzers from the captured arsenal. 60 tons of dead weight wait to be moved across the wilderness. Oxen teams strain against their leather harnesses in the biting December chill. Knox directs his men to lash the heavy artillery to reinforced timber sleds. The expedition departs the fort as the first winter storms howl through the valley. Ice coats the wooden runners and freezes the ropes stiff. The noble train of artillery begins its 300-mile journey toward the coast. Men hack paths through the thick brush of the Berkshire Mountains. Horses struggle to pull the heavy iron loads up the steep, icy inclines. The sleds slide backward toward the deep ravines during every ascent. Knox pushes his laborers to work through the freezing nights to maintain momentum. Deep snowdrifts swallow the wheels of the supply wagons. The men build temporary bridges of logs to cross the partially frozen rivers. Frostbite darkens the fingers of the teamsters as they handle the iron equipment. The heavy cannons sink into the thawing mud of the valley floors. Knox coordinates the relay of fresh draft animals at each colonial settlement. The local farmers watch in silence as the massive train rumbles past their barns. The sound of iron grinding against stone echoes through the mountain passes. The equipment moves with agonizing slowness toward the Cambridge camps. General George Washington waits for the arrival of the heavy firepower. He lacks the artillery necessary to challenge the British hold on Boston. The siege lines outside the city remain static without the Ticonderoga guns. Knox reaches the outskirts of the camp in late January. He unloads the 59 pieces of iron and bronze artillery onto the frozen earth. The arrival of the train changes the strategic balance of the entire war. Washington surveys the massive collection of weapons now at his disposal. The Continental Army finally possesses the tools to threaten the British fleet. The heavy mortars and cannons stand ready to be transported to the heights. The gamble of the winter trek has concluded with a complete success. The focus shifts to the final placement of the guns on the high ground. General George Washington stared at the maps inside his Cambridge headquarters. He needed a way to break the British stalemate in Boston. Colonel Rufus Putnam arrived at the commander's quarters with a set of sketches. The engineer proposed a radical method for rapid fortification. He designed wooden frames known as chandeliers. These structures consisted of heavy timber beams joined by cross braces. Workers could pre-construct these frames away from the front lines. The design allowed laborers to assemble defensive walls without digging. The frames held fascines, which were tightly bound bundles of sticks and brush. These bundles provided instant cover against small arms fire. Washington approved the plan for the occupation of Dorchester Heights. General John Thomas received orders to lead the secret operation. The American artillery commanders prepared for a diversionary action. On March 2, 1776, the bombardment of Boston began in earnest. Heavy cannons roared from the positions at Lechmere Point. Soldiers fired mortar shells from the earthworks at Cobble Hill. The explosions lit up the night sky over the Charles River. British sentries watched the flashes from the city walls. They focused their return fire on the American batteries in the west. The noise masked the sounds of movement further to the south. Teams of men gathered at the assembly points near Dorchester. They carried the prefabricated chandeliers through the dark woods. Hundreds of carts transported the heavy fascines and hay bales. The soldiers moved in absolute silence to avoid detection. They navigated the steep, rocky slopes leading to the heights. Every man knew the success of the mission depended on secrecy. The British fleet remained anchored in the harbor below. Royal Navy officers assumed the American activity was just another raid. They failed to detect the massive troop movement toward the high ground. General Thomas directed his men to place the frames along the ridge. The soldiers lashed the timbers together with thick rope. They stacked the bundles of brush against the wooden skeletons. The fortifications rose from the earth in the dead of night. The men worked until their hands bled in the freezing air. They positioned the heavy cannons behind the new parapets. The American Army transformed the hill into a fortress by sunrise. The British command remained unaware of the transformation until the dawn. The darkness of March 4, 1776, swallowed the slopes of Dorchester Heights. General John Thomas led his men upward in total silence. Heavy wool coats brushed against the frozen brush of the hillside. Carts groaned under the weight of pre-constructed wooden chandeliers. Soldiers carried bundles of sharpened sticks, known as fascines, on their backs. The men moved with deliberate, practiced caution toward the summit. Below them, the lights of Boston shimmered across the cold harbor water. The distant thunder of American cannons echoed from Lechmere Point. The noise provided the cover necessary for the night's work. Teams of engineers assembled the timber frames upon the ridge. They lashed the beams together with thick coils of rope. The wooden skeletons rose against the black silhouette of the night sky. Workers packed the gaps with bundles of hay and heavy brush. The structures formed an instant, impenetrable wall against musket balls. General Thomas directed the placement of the heavy artillery pieces. Iron wheels sank deep into the mud of the freshly dug earth. The barrels of the Ticonderoga cannons pointed toward the British fleet. Laborers rolled heavy wooden casks filled with stones and black powder. These barrel bombs lined the inner edge of the earthen ramparts. The soldiers prepared to roll these traps down the steep slopes. The devices stood ready to crush any infantry attempting an assault. The cold air bit at the faces of the working men. They labored until their fingers went numb from the winter frost. The fortifications transformed the hilltop into a formidable fortress by dawn. The strategic landscape of the American Revolution shifted in those few hours. The British fleet sat exposed within the harbor below the ridge. Every ship at anchor remained within the range of the new batteries. The American position rendered the occupation of Boston untenable for the British. The masterwork of logistics turned a stalemate into a decisive tactical advantage. The sun climbed over the horizon to reveal the impossible construction. British sentries squinted through the morning mist at the skyline. The sudden presence of heavy guns silenced the harbor traffic. General William Howe stared at the heights through his brass telescope. He recognized the shift in the balance of power. The American Army held the high ground with the captured Ticonderoga guns. The entire British garrison faced an immediate and lethal threat from above. Could the British command launch an assault before the artillery opened fire? General William Howe surveyed the harbor through his glass on March 5, 1776. He observed the heavy American guns looming over the city skyline. The British commander ordered an immediate amphibious assault against the heights. Soldiers gathered at the docks while the tide pulled against the wooden hulls. A fierce gale suddenly whipped the waters of Boston Harbor into whitecaps. Rain lashed against the stone piers and flooded the shallow landing craft. The storm rendered the planned naval landing impossible for the British infantry. Howe watched the turbulent waves crash against the silent fortified ridge. The British generals convened a council of war on March 7, 1776. They analyzed the tactical situation from their quarters in occupied Boston. The officers concluded that the American artillery position made the city untenable. Howe issued the formal order for the evacuation of the British garrison. Word of the impending departure reached the American camp at Cambridge. George Washington received word of the British intent to abandon the city. A tense negotiation developed between the two opposing commanders. The British threatened to set the entire city of Boston ablaze. Washington agreed to withhold his artillery fire during the British withdrawal. The Continental Army allowed the fleet to depart without a final bombardment. Howe directed his men to load the ships with supplies and equipment. The British forces prioritized the removal of military stores and ammunition. Troops carried coal and wheat from the warehouses to the waiting transports. The harbor remained unusually quiet during these final days of occupation. Both armies adhered to the tacit agreement throughout the remainder of March. The British command focused on the logistics of moving 11,000 soldiers. The official British narrative described the exit as a strategic repositioning. The reality on the ground reflected a total collapse of the British position. The city of Boston waited in silence as the fleet prepared for sea. The morning of March 17, 1776, broke over a silent harbor. British soldiers scrambled onto the decks of their waiting transports. Loyalist refugees crowded the docks with trunks and heavy bundles. Peter Oliver watched the chaos from the shore. He saw neighbors abandoning their homes and life's work in a single hour. The harbor air turned thick with the smoke of burning supplies. General William Howe ordered the destruction of remaining military stores. Heavy crates of ammunition splashed into the dark, freezing water. The massive fleet of over 100 ships swung toward the open sea. 11,000 soldiers departed the city they had occupied for months. Over 1,000 Loyalists huddled on the crowded decks of the transports. They looked back at the receding hills of Boston through a gray mist. Most of these families never saw their homes again. The Continental Army marched into the abandoned city by midday. George Washington's men moved through the quiet, empty streets of Boston. They found warehouses filled with coal, wheat, and abandoned iron tools. The soldiers seized the military stores left behind by the retreating fleet. The British occupation of the primary colonial port had finally ended. The strategic center of gravity for the war shifted southward. Victory came not through a final bloody assault on the city walls. It was won by the threat of heavy artillery on the high ground. The British military machine broke against the logistics of a single night. You look at the empty horizon and see only the calm of a quiet sea. But the cannons that once loomed over the harbor are still aimed at you. The ground you stand on is never as solid as it seems to be. The next shift in the tide is already moving beneath your feet.